Forge Gang! I am still a hard man! Let's go! Raho! All right, this is it. Pagan Europe gets its revenge. The pagans of the north, the Norsemen, the men of the Norse. This time, I am your host, Imperator of Forge, and today I will be talking about some of the most fearless, courageous, brave, and outright stalwart people to have ever lived. I will be talking about the Vikings. Viking, by the way, is a occupation, a job occupation. So, not all Scandinavians or Northerners were necessarily Vikings. Viking was an occupation. It was kind of like a pirate. So, there had been pirates in classical antiquity. And of course, there were the famous buccaneers of the 1500s and 1600s and early 1700s, Captain Kidd, Blackbeard, and others. And maybe one day we shall be talking about them with Life of Piracy. But for now, this is the Viking Age. 792 to 1066. Some people say that the Viking Age didn't end until 1100. So we'll be talking about the 8th to the 11th centuries AD. After the fall of the empire in the West, the Western Roman Empire in 476, Europe became a hotbed of various movements of peoples. New peoples and new migrants arrived from the barbarian north and began to invade into France, Holland, Belgium, England, Spain, and Italy. This was known as the Age of the Migrations, and it triggered and started the Middle Ages. The Vikings and the Norse raids and the great seafaring journeys of the Norse were in many ways a continuation of what had happened a few centuries before. The Roman historian Tacitus had talked about in his Germania or Germania the various life and living styles and habits of the Germanic peoples of ancient Teutonia or ancient Germania. Hundreds of years later, a brave and fearless seafaring people, Germanic people, would continue the lifestyle of what Tacitus had talked about. Join me today as we talk about the life of the Vikings. This article was made by Tim Lambert, a British historian. All credit goes to Tim Lambert. He wrote this, and all credit goes to him. A History of the Vikings by Tim Lambert. The ancestors of the Vikings traded with the Romans. They exported furs, skins, walrus ivory, and amber. After the fall of Rome, the Scandinavian peoples slowly grew more united. This is written in sagas like Beowulf, the various sagas and eddas, or poetic and prose eddas. Some of them actually take place before the beginning of the Viking Age. A lot of it happened before the Viking Age. So we got some complaints in the chat in regards to low volume. So I'll go ahead and take care of that right fast before we get into this. All right. I think that's as loud as it can go. All right. A history of the Vikings. The ancestors of the Vikings traded with the Romans. They exported furs, skins, walrus ivory, and amber. After the fall of Rome, the Scandinavian people slowly grew more united. The first towns were formed. Meanwhile, they started using sails. Before the mid-7th century, Scandinavian ships were rowed, but once they began using sails, they could make the long voyage across the North Sea, with devastating results for the people who lived further south. At the end of the 8th century, Scandinavians began raiding other parts of Europe. Then, in the 9th and 10th centuries, they turned to conquest. These new raiders and invaders were known as Northmen, Norsemen, or Vikings. The Vikings plundered monasteries of gold and jewels. They also took livestock and kidnapped children to be slaves. However, although they terrorized Europe, the Vikings were also great traders and craftsmen. So the Vikings were more than just simply pirates and raiders. They were a very civilized people. They revived trade in northern Europe after the fall of Rome. They exported ivory, seals, whales, bones, and coinage. In fact, they brought the first coinage to Ireland, and they also founded some of the first towns in Ireland. The Vikings in the Vikings in Caledonia or in Scotland. In 795, the Vikings raided the monastery at Iona, the first of many such raids on Scotland. During the 9th century, they settled the Shetlands, the Orkneys, and the Hebrides. Vikings also settled in Caithness and Sutherland. Caithness. Vikings also settled in Caithness and Sutherland. They called the latter region Sutherland or Southern Land, and so they gave that part of Scotland its name. However, Scandinavian power in Scotland waned in the 12th and 13th centuries. In 1202, the Vikings or the Norwegians lost all their land in Caithness and Sutherland. Then, in 1263, the Scots crushed the Norwegians at the Battle of Largs. Consequently, by the Treaty of Perth, 1266, the Norwegians surrendered all their territory in Scotland apart from the Orkneys and the Shetlands in return for a large sum of money. The Vikings in Hibernia or in Ireland. The Vikings first attacked Ireland in 795. They looted monasteries. They also took women and children as slaves. However, the Vikings were not only raiders, they were also traders and craftsmen. In the 9th century, they founded Ireland's first towns, Dublin, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. They also gave Ireland its name, a combination of the Gaelic word Airi and the Viking word Airi and the Viking word land, hence Ireland, a combination of Irish Gaelic and Old Norse. In time, the Vikings settled down. They intermarried with the Irish and accepted Christianity. Around 940, the great High King Brian Boru was born. At that time, the Danes had conquered much of the kingdom of Munster. Brian defeated them in several battles. In 968, he recaptured Cashel, the capital of Munster. The capital of Munster. After 976, Brian was king of Munster, and in 1002, or in 1002, he became the High King of Ireland. However, in 1014, Leinster, the people of Dublin and the Danes joined forces against him. Brian fought and defeated them at the Battle of Clontarf on 23rd April 1014, although he was killed himself. This victory ended the Viking threat in Ireland. The Vikings in England. In 787, 3 Danish ships landed at Dorset. A royal official called a reeve went to meet them. He assumed the strangers had come to trade. Instead, they killed him and sailed away. Then, in 793, when Norsemen raided a monastery at Lindisfarne, they followed a respite until 835, when the Danes descended on the Isle of Sheppey. However, although the Viking raiders were fearsome, they were not invincible. In 836, the Danes joined forces with the Celts of Cornwall. However, they were defeated by Egbert, King of Wessex, at Hingston Down. Nevertheless, the Danes continued raiding England. In 840, a force of Saxons from Hampshire crushed a Danish force at Southampton. However, the same year, Saxons from Dorset were defeated by the Danes at Portland. In 841, the Danes ravaged Kent, East Anglia, and what is now Lincolnshire. In 842, they sacked Southampton. Further Viking raids occurred in 843 and again in 845. In the latter year, the Saxons defeated the Danes in a battle at the mouth of the river Parret in Somerset. Then in 850 to 51, the Vikings spent the winter on the Isle of Thanet. In the spring, they attacked the Mercians and defeated them in battle. However, they were later defeated by an army from Wessex. In 854, another Danish force wintered on the Isle of Sheppey before raiding England. There then followed a relatively peaceful period in which the Vikings raided England only once. However, the Danes eventually stopped raiding and turned instead to conquest. In the autumn of 865, an army of Danes landed in East Anglia. In the following year, 866, they captured York. The Northumbrians attacked the Vikings occupying York in 867, but they were defeated. The Danes then installed a man named Egbert as the puppet ruler of Northumbria. The Danes then marched south, and they spent the winter of 867 in Nottingham. In 869, they marched to Thetford in East Anglia. In the spring of 870, they crushed an army of East Anglians. The Danes were now in control of Northumbria, part of Mercia, and East Anglia. They then turned their attention to Wessex. At the end of 870, they captured Reading. The men of Wessex won a victory at Ashdown. However, the Danes then won two battles at Basing and an unidentified location. Then, in the spring of 871, Alfred became king of Wessex. He became known in history and legend as Alfred the Great. The Saxons and the Danes fought several battles during 871, but the Danes were unable to break Saxon resistance, so they made a peace treaty, and the Danes turned their attention to the other parts of England. In 873, they attacked the unoccupied part of Marcia. The Marcian king fled and was replaced by a puppet ruler. Afterward, Wessex remained the only independent Saxon kingdom. A lot of writings from this time period, talk a lot about apocalyptic events and compare the Vikings to evil demons, or like vile, evil, ravenous wolves. And the Vikings sometimes called themselves the children of the wolf, or the tribe of the wolf. Calling themselves wolf children, or the tribe of the wolf, was very common in Germanic societies. In 875, a Danish army invaded Wessex again. However, they were unable to conquer Wessex, so in 877 they withdrew to Gloucester. In 878, they launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, or Chippenham. King Alfred was forced to flee and hide in the marshes of Athelney. Alfred fought a guerrilla war for some months, then took on the Danes in battle. The Danes were routed at the Battle of Edington. Afterward, Guthrum, the Danish leader, and his men were baptized and made a treaty with Alfred. They split southern and central England between them. Guthrum took London, East Anglia, and all the territory east of the old Roman road, Watling Street. Later, this Danish kingdom became known as the Danelaw. Alfred took the land west of Watling Street and southern England. However, in 886, Alfred's men captured London, but the wars with the Danes were not over. In 892, some Danes who had been attacking France turned their attention to Kent. In 893, the Saxons defeated them, and they withdrew into Essex, part of the Danelaw. Meanwhile, in 893, another group of Danes sailed to Devon, and laid siege to Exeter. They withdrew in 894. They sailed to Sussex and landed near Chichester. This time, the local Saxons marched out and utterly defeated them in battle. War with the Danes continued in 895 to 896. Danes from the Danelaw marched into what is now Shropshire, but they were forced to withdraw. There then followed a few years of peace. Then, in 980, the Danes returned. They attacked the Isle of Thanet, Southampton, and Cheshire. In 981, they raided Devon and Cornwall, and in 983, they attacked Dorset. The Danes continued to raid England. They returned in 991, 992, 993, and 994. In 997, a Danish army came and systematically raided southern England for 3 years. The Danes sailed to Normandy in 1001, but they returned to England in 1002. In 1003, they raided the southwest, and in 1004, they plundered East Anglia. In 1006, they raided southeast England. In 1009 to 1012, they ravaged eastern England. The Saxons paid the Danes to stop raiding and return home. However, the amount the Danes demanded increased each time. In 991, they were paid £10,000 to go home. In 1002, they were paid £24,000, and in 1007, they were paid £36,000. England was drained of its resources by paying these huge sums of money called Dane gold. England finally gained peace only in 1016, when a Dane called Canute became king. And this is a Viking longhouse. As you can see, the Vikings were very creative and expert craftsmen. This is a long timber-framed Viking longhouse, probably a hall where they would feast and gather for different events. The Vikings in Central Europe. The Vikings also raided what is now the Netherlands, Germany, and France. In 845, Vikings attacked Hamburg. The same year, Vikings besieged Paris, and the French king paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. In 885, the Vikings besieged Paris again. This time, the French king arrived with a relief army and drove them away. Finally, in 911, the French king made a treaty with a Viking leader called Harolf, or Rollo. He gave Harolf what is now Normandy as a dukedom. In return, Harolf became a Christian and protected France, or Western Francia, from further Viking attacks. In 1066, his descendants, led by William, conquered England. The Vikings in Eastern and Southern Europe. In the 9th century, Swedish Vikings sailed from the Baltic Sea along rivers into Russia and Ukraine and settled there. The Slavs called the Vikings Rus, and they gave their name to Russia, the land of the Ruses. From Russia, the Vikings sailed into the Black Sea and attacked the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire. In 844, the Vikings attacked Spain and Portugal. At that time, the Iberian Peninsula was controlled by Muslims. They sacked Lisbon, Cadiz, and Medina Sidonia, then captured Seville, then captured Savella, then captured Savilla. However, the Muslims counterattacked and defeated them. The survivors fled. The Vikings carried out further raids on Spain and Portugal, but the Muslims fought back effectively. The Vikings in Iceland. The first people to settle in Iceland were probably Irish monks who came in the 8th century. However, in the 9th century, they were driven out by Vikings. According to tradition, the first Viking to discover Iceland was a man named Nobdod, who got lost while on his way to the Faroes. Following him, a Swede named Gardar Savarsson circumnavigated Iceland in about 860. However, the first Viking attempt to settle was by a Norwegian named Floki Vilgardarsson. He landed in the northwest, but a severe winter killed his domestic animals, and he sailed back to Norway. However, he gave the land its name. He called it Iceland. Then, in the late 9th century, many settlers came to Iceland from Norway and the Viking colonies in the British Isles. A Norwegian named Ingolfur Arnarsson led them. He sailed with his family, slaves, and animals. When he sighted Iceland, Ingolfur dedicated his wooden post to his gods and then threw them overboard. He vowed to settle at the place where the sea washed them up. He then explored Iceland. when the posts were found in the southwest. Ingolfer and his household settled there. He called the place Wekjavik, meaning Smoky Bay. Many other Vikings followed him to Iceland. The land was free to whoever wanted it. A man could claim as much land as he could light fires around in one day, while a woman could claim as much land as she could lead a heifer round in one day. There were very good fishing grounds around Iceland, and the land was well suited to sheep. Many Vikings brought flocks with them, and soon sheep became a major Icelandic industry. The population of Iceland soared. By around 930, about 60,000 people were living in Iceland. In 985, Eric the Red led a group of colonists to Greenland. Then, in 986, a Viking called Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course by a storm, and he spotted a new land. However, he sailed away without landing. In 1001, a man named Leif Erikson landed in the new land, which he named Vinland. It was part of North America. However, Eriksson did not stay permanently. Later, the Vikings did establish a colony in North America, but they abandoned it because of conflict with the natives. And this is a view of a boat. This is a view of a boat, or a Viking longboat, going into the Norwegian fjords. All right, what was life like in Viking society? Life in Viking times. This article was written by Tim Lambert. All credit goes to Tim Lambert. Viking society. Upper class Vikings were called jarls, from which we derive our word earl. Below them was a class of farmers and craftsmen called carls. At the bottom of the heap was a class of slaves called thralls. Slavery was common in the world at that time. It was accepted as an inevitable part of life. The Vikings captured women and children on their raids and made them slaves. They were sold in markets and had no rights. Slaves did the hardest and most unpleasant work. However, Viking women had a good deal of freedom, especially compared to later in the Middle Ages. Viking merchants and craftsmen. Viking merchants imported glass and silk from the Byzantine Empire. They also imported spices, fine wool, and wine. They exported slaves, furs, beeswax, honey, and walrus ivory. Viking craftsmen included blacksmiths, bronzesmiths, coopers, leather tanners, saddlers, shoemakers, and other men who made leather goods like purses and belts. They also had jewelers and men who carved bowls from soapstone. Other craftsmen carved bones and antlers into goods like combs. The Vikings also had their own form of writing. The Viking Norse alphabet was called the Futhark. Futhark, Futhark, and the 16 individual letters were called runes. They were made of straight and diagonal lines. They were carved into wood or stone. In the late Viking era, people wrote on sheep or calf skin. Viking weapons. Vikings wore iron helmets. Some of them also wore chainmail. They also carried round wooden shields. They fought with spears, bows, axes, and swords. In battle, Vikings stood in rows and formed a wall of shields called a Skjaldarborg. Skjaldarborg. The Vikings also built fortresses. They dug a ditch and created an earth bank, then erected a wooden stockade on top. Viking helmets. So these are some Viking helmets. Viking food. The Vikings grew wheat, barley, and rye. They made bread and porridge. Sometimes they added peas to the porridge to make it go further. They also ate cabbages, onions, and leeks, and they used herbs like dill and coriander. The Vikings grew apples and plums, and they gathered wild berries. Fish was an important part of the Viking diet, and they ate cod and herring. They also raised pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats. Sheep and goats were used for milk. Vikings also kept geese and chickens. However, the Vikings could not grow enough food to keep much livestock through the winter. So in autumn, they killed many animals and salted or smoked the meat to preserve it. The Vikings were fond of pork and beef, but they also ate horse meat and goat meat, and they hunted deer for venison. The Vikings also hunted whales and seals. Meat was roasted on a pit. Viking women also boiled food in an iron cauldron. Vikings drank mead, a drink made from honey, water, and yeast, beer, and, if they could afford it, wine. The Vikings ate from wooden bowls and dishes. Spoons were made of horn, or for the well-off metal. The Vikings also ate with knives, but there were no forks. They often drank from hollow horns called drinking horns. This is a drinking horn. And in fact, just about everyone drank from horns. Viking homes. A Viking home often consisted of just one room, although in a well-off family, mom and dad might have a separate bedroom. The house was usually made with a wooden frame, which was filled in with timber planks or wattle and daub, wickerwork and plaster. However, in areas where wood was scarce, like Greenland, stone was used for building, and roofs might be made of turf. In a Viking house, there were no panes of glass, so windows had to be small. At night, wooden shutters covered them. Viking houses were dark because the windows were small, and the only light came from oil lamps carved from soapstone. In the center of the hut was a hearth, where the cooking was done. However, there was no chimney. Viking homes had little furniture. In the hut, there would be a table and stools, but chairs were a luxury. Chests were used to store tools and clothes. Only wealthy Vikings could afford beds. Most people slept on benches with rugs around the side of the hut. Even if you had a bed, the mattress was not very comfortable. It was stuffed with straw or down. Blankets were made of wool, otherwise, you used furs. Rich people might have tapestries on the walls, but there were no carpets on the floors. Instead, people spread rushes on them. To us, Viking ho to us, Viking houses would seem very uncomfortable. They were cold and drafty, dark and smoky. The furniture was hard and uncomfortable. Viking clothes. Viking women spun and wove cloth at home and made the family's clothes. Women wore a dress-like garment called a shift made of linen or wool. Over it they wore a dress open at the sides, held with shoulder straps. In cold weather they wore cloaks or shawls. Clothing was held in place by brooches. Viking women often had their hair plaited or held under a headscarf. Viking men wore trouser-like garments and linen shirts and tunics. They usually wore beards. Both sexes wore jewelry and had tattoos. Viking games, or wore jewelry. Viking games. The Vikings enjoyed many sports, including swimming, wrestling, skiing, and ice skating. They also practiced archery. Vikings also enjoyed hunting and falconry. They were also fond of horse fighting. Indoors they played dice and a board game called Hanafatafel. Hanafatafel. They also played chess. Vikings also played a game similar to backgammon called Kavartrutafel. Kavartrutafel. And in an early form of draughts. The Vikings were also fond of listening to stories and telling riddles. Rich Vikings held great feasts. At them, poets called skalds sang poems praising their lord's brave deeds. Viking musical instruments included harps, horns, and wooden pipes. Viking transport. The Vikings built long and slender ships called longboats for raiding. Longboats could be up to 23 meters long. For trade, they built shorter and broader ships called cunors. The Vikings also built a type of little rowing boat with 4 oars called a fairing, and a boat with 6 oars called a saxairing, which were used for fishing. Viking ships were clinker built, i.e., they were made with overlapping planks. They had a single square sail and up to 50 oars. On land, in summer, goods were transported by pack horse or cart, but in Viking lands in winter, sleds were used. People rode horses or walked in summer, but in winter they used skis or skates made from bone. Viking roads were just dirt tracks, but in towns they were paved with wooden planks. In alleys, panels of wattle, a kind of wicker work, were laid down to keep your feet out of the mud. So, those are aspects of life in the Viking Age, or aspects of life in the Viking Age. Viking lifestyle, everyday life in the Viking Age. The Viking Age is full of stories of adventure, bravery, and conflict. Yet, the ordinary nature of how the people lived by day to day in the Viking Age surprises many. Here's an introduction to the Viking lifestyle. Whenever someone mentions Vikings, the general picture painted in the mind's eye is of blurry blonde dudes with horn-winged helmets hopping out of a boat, sword and axe in hand, ready to burn, plunder, and do all sorts of nasty things to whoever crosses their path. The truth of the matter, however, is that these acts of raiding really only took up a fraction of the times people spent during the Viking Age. Relatively few people took part in these expeditions, with the majority staying at home to work the land. In fact, the word Viking was reserved for those few warriors who set sail in search of trade or new lands, rather than to describe everyone who lived in the Scandinavian lands during the time period. Some of those who stayed at home would later join the Vikings in new settlements, for example, in Iceland or Scotland, working the farms. For the most part, the Norse people in the Viking Age were farmers. The majority of the crops they grew were things such as oats, barley, and wheat, with a number of vegetables taking root here and there. Much like Norway today, there were plenty of livestock scattered across the countryside: pigs, cattle, sheep, horses, chickens, all the basics of European farms. Archaeological evidence suggests people in the Viking Age lived in small communities. And by small, they were very small. Only barely a few hundred people, if even that. Plenty of other trades were alive and well at the time. Boat builders and wood craftsmen, blacksmiths, leather workers, fishers, even merchants were not uncommon occupations for people like Ragnar or Rollo, Haralth. Many people in the Viking Age would do some of the above, but as time went on and larger settlements came to be, there began to be some Norsemen who specialized in one or two particular trades. Animal-based clothing. When it came to clothing themselves, Vikings were particularly fond of wool and lots of animal skins. Viking women were very skilled weavers, able to make beautiful patterns from wool dyed with plants. For men's fashion, it was pretty standard with pants and shirts of varying lengths. For women, the standard fashion was long woolen dresses. There is plenty of debate on what the styles of the Vikings really were, as not much of their clothing has survived the battle with time. Having said that, it can generally be assumed that the styles you see on television and in films are probably not historically accurate representations. For one thing, the Vikings loved bling. Men and women were likely beckoned in rings. Men and women were likely bedecked in rings, bracelets, necklaces, armbands, and so on. Beautifully crafted metals have survived well, and jewelry made from leather, bone, and wood was not uncommon either. Simple living spaces. For a long day after a long day toiling in the fields, or at the end of a long voyage to haul back loot, plunder, and slaves, there was nothing better for a Viking than to pick up their feet at home. A reconstructed Viking longhouse in Norway. One common misconception was that Vikings were one people. We often speak of them as a collective. But although the vast majority of Vikings were Norse, the reality was that they lived in many small, desperate communities. In Norway, these would have been along fjords or on narrow sounds that would provide shelter, good fishing opportunities, and strategic defensive positions. For the chief enemies at the time, there for the chief enemies at the time were other Viking communities. Viking longhouses were built of wood, mud, stone, or a college of all the above. The home was generally shaped rectangular-ish and with a sweet hole in the roof to let out the smoke of a probably always burning fire. Viking homes didn't differ much from other structures around Europe of that time period, though they were much less grand than how they are often depicted, and perhaps with better methods of insulating the space to keep in the heat during those long, dark, and cold Nordic winters. Food from the ocean and the farms. What did people eat? Unsurprisingly, fish made up a large portion of the Viking diet. They also had plenty of other proteins to choose from. Pork was the most popular, while horse meat kebabs likely graced many a table. The main meal time would often consist of a stew that had been simmering for most of the day, perhaps even longer. It would have been common for the stews to be in a state of constant renewal, lasting several days and topped up with whatever meat and vegetables were available. Honey was among the items traded by the Vikings. Bread was made from the different grains they grew on their farms. Added to that were the fruits, berries, and nuts that could be foraged from around the farms in the mountains. The only nuts that we believe the Norse obtained locally were hazelnuts. Walnuts seem to form part of the diet. Walnuts seem to form part of the diet, but these would have come from trading abroad. Norse people kept cattle primarily for the milk. Aside from drinking the fresh milk, they made dairy products including butter and soft cheeses. Still popular in Iceland today is skyr, a yogurt-like sweet and sour soft curd cheese. It was a well-loved product in the Viking Age, highly regarded because of its ability to preserve protein for 6 months or longer. Apart from milk and water, people in the Viking Age were fond of beer and mead. Norse beer would have been weak by modern standards, while mead is a form of honey wine. fun through competitive games. Like many other archaic societies, a lot of the entertainment came from sports such as wrestling, racing, and fighting games. Vikings even had board games to occupy their time. Researchers suggest that the famous Isle of Lewis chessmen were created right here in Trondheim, before ending up off the coast of Scotland, although these are dated to be from the very tail end of the time of the Vikings. Close-up of a Lewis chess set. Photo Rennie Coles, Shutterstock.com. It can be assumed that these were grown out of a longer history of tabletop games. The best known table game in Scandinavia was Hanafatafel. It's likely this is the game they played with the Viking Age gaming piece discovered recently on Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was, of course, the location of the raid that most researchers take as defining the beginning of the Viking Age. Researchers believe the game piece, a small glass crown, is a rare archaeological link to early Norse raiders. Warrior poets seem to have been commonplace as well. On many days, the towns, the farm, or the great halls were filled with music, poetry, and storytelling. And, of course, the Vikings loved skiing and drinking mead. Women in the Viking Age. Modern depictions of the era in popular TV and movie dramas have blurred our understanding of the role women played during the Viking Age. Recent archaeological discoveries have raised new questions, but the common belief is that despite a surprising amount of gender equality, the influence of women was mainly domestic. They were unlikely to join men in battle, although unlikely doesn't mean it never happened. If you enjoyed this article, why not share it on Pinterest? We've got just the pin for you. Just hit those social sharing buttons to get started. So this is lifeinnorway.net Viking lifestyle hashtag. All right, sonsofvikings.com. Life during the Viking Age. It has been nearly 1,000 years since the last Vikings ventured abroad raiding and pillaging peasant towns and Christian monasteries. Yet the enduring imagery of monks being slaughtered and churches being looted is ever present in our minds. Every time someone utters the word Viking, we tend only to think of violent, barbaric warriors in blood-stained tunics who went off raiding, killing, and plundering. Although Vikings did indeed raid, kill, and plunder, many people fail to realize that most Vikings were primarily farmers, fishermen, merchants, carpenters, and craftsmen. Just like every other society during the Middle Ages, Vikings needed to provide food for their families, which usually meant working the land and maintaining the family farmstead. This is a Viking longhouse. This is a Viking longhouse interior, or what it was like inside a Viking longhouse. The farmstead was the center of daily life during the Viking Age, and healthy crops with a bountiful harvest were critical to surviving the brutal Scandinavian winters. It was important that everyone do their part to help maintain the family farm, and many tasks of doing so were divided between men and women. In Viking Age Scandinavia, men were generally responsible for tasks occurring outside the threshold, outside of the house, while women were generally responsible for tasks occurring within the threshold, inside of the house. Men were responsible for managing the fields, fertilizing, plowing, sowing, harvesting, and threshing the crops, as well as hunting for wild game. They were also responsible for representing the family in society at large. Men were the only ones who could voice their opinions at the assemblies, the Althings, and witness and prosecute the law. Women were responsible for providing their husbands with offspring and the care of infants, and small children could have occupied much of their time. Women were also responsible for preparing food for the family. Women managed dairy production, baking bread, storing food rations, and preparing mead and other drinks. Dairy production included milk, butter, and cheese, often done through the milking of cows and sheep. One of the most important tasks that women were responsible for was the production of cloth. Making clothes out of sheep's wool and plant fibers, such as flax and hemp, was an extremely long process. First, a Viking woman needed to shear the sheep, and tearing the wool off of the sheep with one's hands was still practiced widely during the Viking Age. Next, the wool needed to be spun into thread and woven together on the loom. Women were responsible for the weaving of the sails of Viking longships and dyeing the cloth if necessary. This is another Viking longhouse. The Viking farmstead was made up of the fertile farmland on which the Vikings grew their crops. The farmstead also included longhouses in which the Viking family lived, as well as a series of outbuildings where food was stored for the winter and slaves and servants lived. Perhaps the most important assets to the farmstead were the animals which were used for almost every part of daily living. Animals were primarily used to produce milk and wool. However, oxen would have been used to plow the fields, while horses were essential in transportation. Farm animals were very important to the Vikings and were rarely killed and eaten. Wild game was the meat of choice at the time. Only during famines, when all the food was gone, would Vikings kill and eat their livestock. The Viking longhouse was of a simple wooden design, where the number of posts placed in the ground would support a roof. Occasionally, longhouses were built with walls instead of posts, and tended to vary in design depending on the location or terrain they were built upon. Smaller buildings, such as workshops and storage houses, were built close to the longhouse, while the barn and stables were situated further away. Pharaoh stamp, showing Viking farm life. Like most societies during the medieval era, the Vikings' survival depended upon a successful harvest and plenty of food to eat. One famine could wipe out an entire year's worth of difficult labor, so multiple sources of food were critically important. Hunting and fishing were both excellent sources of food, as the wildlife of Scandinavia provided a vast array of options. Many bodies of water throughout Scandinavia allowed fish to be caught relatively close to the farmstead with very basic equipment: spear, net, and line, and small boats. Lakes and rivers contained many kinds of fish, although salmon was the most important. Sea animals were also caught and hunted, including whales, seals, and walruses. Although whale and seal meat was eaten, the most valuable product of these animals were their blubber. Seal blubber was eaten as an alternative to butter, used in fueling oil lamps and to create the tar needed to cover the boats. Walruses were hunted for their valuable ivory, which was used in decorative art. Their thick hides could be made into ropes. Hunting gave farmers an excellent supply of meat and furs, which could be sold for money. Squirrel, marten, fox, and bear were mostly hunted for their fur, while deer, elk, and reindeer were hunted for their meat. Wild birds were also hunted, with the bow and arrow being the weapon of choice. With such a vast array of wildlife available, it was important that the Vikings diversify their food sources. Famine and disease were very common during the Viking Age, so plenty of food was needed to survive. Life as a Viking was both difficult and dangerous. Famine and disease were widespread. Children died in devastatingly large numbers, and farm work was unpleasant and extremely labor intensive. The tools used by farmers would be considered massively inadequate today and quickly wore out and broke. The production of a single dress or piece of clothing would have taken weeks to make. Both men and women worked with animal dung regularly. Life on a Viking farmstead was not as safe as one might think. But going off to raid and pillage wasn't any safer. It's important to realize the amount of strength and tolerance required to every man, woman, and child during this period. It was crucial that everyone do their part to ensure the survival of the family. Daily life during the Viking Age was a team effort, and if we can understand the strength required to endure life at home, perhaps we can know why the Vikings were so successful on their expeditions abroad. This is a Faroe Island stamp. Oh, dude, the Vikings were such feminists. Dude. Alright, I already read about the Vikings in Britain. Let's see here. Alright. The Viking legacy is strong in Norway, with many fascinating artifacts, museums, tours, and living villages throughout the country. What would have been the equivalent of today's cutting edge technology 1,000 years ago? The fast moving Viking ships, perhaps. These advanced vassals helped build cultural coherence in Europe and were crucial to unifying the Norse tribes into a state. The Vikings put their mark on Northern Europe forever, and the many remnants of their culture can transform your holiday into an adventure. Viking history and culture. The Viking Age began in the year of 793 with an attack on the Lindisfarne monastery in England, but was then Northumbria, which is the first known Viking raid. The event that marks the end of their glory days is the slaying of King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Raids, looting, colonization, and trade brought the Vikings to many destinations in the known world and beyond. In the beginning, only a few seafaring Vikings survived the rough voyages, but the fleets grew over time, and there were soon hundreds of vassals known as longships. They sailed across the Baltic Sea and down Russian rivers as far as the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea to Byzantium and the Caliphate of Baghdad. Vikings were also the first Europeans to reach Greenland and North America. In fact, the Viking explorer Leif Erikson arrived on the shores of North America around the year 1000, 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Viking colonization. The Vikings founded many cities and colonies, including Dublin in Ireland and the region of Normandy in France. Dublin was held as a significant settlement for more than 3 centuries. Between the years 879 and 920, Vikings colonized Iceland, which in turn became the springboard for the colonization of Greenland. Remains of a Viking settlement at Les Ancets aux Meadows in Newfoundland have been carbon dated to around the year 1000. How could a small and scattered people conquer so much territory? The Norwegian Vikings are characterized by their courageous, fatalistic outlook, which made them naturally born risk takers. The raiding group seemed to have found a fantastic ability to shrug off losses, whether in land battles or in dangerous sea expeditions. The number of deaths caused by war was sometimes shockingly high in relation to the total Viking population, but it did not satisfy their hunger for conquest and exploration for around 250 years. Peaceful tradesmen and mead drinkers. The Vikings are mostly known for their relentless pillaging, and rightly so. At the same time, many of them lived peacefully as traders and farmers, and many expeditions were based on barter deals. Those who stayed home supported their families through simple farming activities. Their daily life might have been tough and demanding, but was not without joy. The most well-known Viking drink was mead, mojod in Norwegian, an alcoholic beer-like brew sweetened with honey. The end of the Viking Age. The explorers brought their cultural identity to continental Europe, while importing foreign culture, languages, and knowledge. By the 1100s, the Vikings were in decline due to a combination of domestic disputes and resistance from other European countries, which had learnt the painful lesson that they needed to defend themselves against attacks by building fortifications under the feudal system. Viking ships. On a good day, the rowers could move as quickly as 15 to 17 knots. The swiftness of the Viking ship is key to understanding how these warriors could gain such sudden and surprising momentum. Their maritime innovations provided link between the North and Southern Europe, which had a strong impact on the continent. Innovative ship design. The design of the Vikings' iconic vessels, called longships, were adopted by several other cultures and influenced shipbuilding for centuries. Briefly described, the method involved overlapping planks of oak that are nailed together and protected by layers of tarred wool and sometimes animal hair. The secret behind the fast-moving longship is its long, narrow hull, kept stable by a keel. Light enough to be carried, it was designed for speed and easy navigation in shallow waters. The longship was double-ended, allowing it to reverse direction without the need to turn. This was a significant advantage in a sea filled with concealed icebergs and sea ice. Longships had oars almost the entire length of the vessel, with later versions adding sails. Multi-purpose vessels. The ships were used for plundering and other attacks, as well as for peaceful trade. Many Vikings died in battles in continental Europe. In 876, around 4,000 men and 120 ships were lost in a massive storm off the south coast of England. When prominent Vikings died, they were laid to rest in a burial ship along with their clothes, jewelry, and even their horses and livestock. One of the most significant graves found in Scandinavia is the Oseberg burial mound. In the year 834, the Oseberg queen was buried in an impressive ship, together with her precious belongings. The grave also contained the remains of a second female of unknown origin. Female power. What role did women play in Viking history? Women are said to have had a stronger position in Viking society than in most other parts of Europe. They usually had the right to divorce, and if their spouse passed away, they would inherit his estate and retain ownership of his belongings. They had partial legal protection against sexual harassment. A woman was respected as the head of the farm when her husband was away, which he could be for a long time. Today's fascination with Viking culture is not only based on their image as relentless seafaring warriors, but also a result of their way of life and role in developing a new and more modern society. All right. Belongings. And that is some of the history about life in the Viking Age. I wanted to portray a decent and accurate portrayal of the Vikings as much as I could. And I wanted to try my best to portray what they were actually like. They were not just raiders and fighters, brave though they were. They were farmers, they were craftsmen, husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, and they did many different types of occupations. So, is there any sound problems right now? I'm going to go through chat. Third for the second, how are you doing? Good, sir. Forge Gang 1, haters lost. Truth revealed. Third for the second says, we was Vikings in she. How are you doing, Sebastian Moran? Skål, skåla. Hail Odin. Sebastian Moran says, sound is very low, Warhammer. Third for the second says, they exported fursuits. Oh no. No, third for they exported animal furs and hazelnuts, as well as honey and slaves, and bartered in the south for exported and manufactured products that they took back to Scandinavia. Third for the second says that the Celts won. No, I would say that the Saxons and Vikings won because England exists. What is up, interdimensional lizard? How are you doing? So, this is how it all happened. Alrighty then, I have been... Oh. Interdimensional Lizard says, all this and more can be explained in the video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla. No, modern video games that talk about this time period are garbage. Anyways, I am your host, Imperator of Forge. This has been Life in the Viking Age, or the Norseman Age. Finally, with the conversion and the pacification of the last of these great barbarians, we can move on into the Middle Ages proper. I will see you next time. Until then, peace. Forge Gang! I am still a hard man!